I, Robot is one of those movies that audience have been waiting a long time for a sequel. The studio wanted it, but Will Smith was the #1 star in those years and was drowning in the hundreds of scripts that were being thrown at him. The money he was offered for a sequel to I, Robot he could have gotten for any other movie. And Smith didn't want to repeat himself, considering the fact that the first film wasn't easy for him. Most likely the main reason that the sequel did not happen is because the first film, although it was a box office hit, was not successful enough for the studio to spend too much money on the actor. As for example Sony did on Third Man in Black. Smith didn't want to do that movie either, but the first two films made a lot more money than I, Robot. So Smith was just showered with gold, and as a result he made over $100 million on one film. Actually, that's Smith's trademark trick of not doing sequels that are offered to him. Something similar happened with Hancock and I Am Legend. In the latter case, some kind of sequel might seem strange, but they wanted to get out of that trap with a prequel. So the producers chased Will Smith with bags of money for years, and the studio still hasn't given up on its production, because $600 million for the first film is too sweet to give up on it. For today, let's recall the film I, Robot, which does not look like a particularly problematic film, and it has a success of some kind, but the production was sometimes a living hell. I, Robot was originally supposed to be a slightly different film. The budget was also supposed to be a lot smaller. Certainly not something independent, where everybody is working for food, but a blockbuster was out of the question. It was supposed to be a really dystopian and dark movie. So everybody's suffering and walking around with frowning faces and often staring at the horizon with thoughtful eyes. And there was no Asimov. He's not particularly noticeable in the final film either, but back then his name wasn't even supposed to be mentioned. It was just a movie about the robot fugitive who thought that he is different from everyone else. But when the script was written, Disney Studios, where the project originated, became worried about too much violence in the movie. Director Bryan Singer, who had been assigned to the project, couldn't convince the studio to continue funding, so the project was shelved. However, the potential of the idea was noticed at the Fox Studios, whose producers took it to themselves. The only thing they agreed on was that the dark dystopian script had to be lost. Otherwise, there is a good chance they might unlock some other potential, but the box office potential would definitely be left out. That's when Asimov was brought up. The film is believed to be based on a collection of the writer's stories, but the filmmakers themselves say it's more accurate to say that the film was inspired by Asimov's work. And in fact, Asimov was used when it turned out that the studio had the rights to his books. As the budget for the film was already more impressive, the studio started looking for a star actor whose face could later be traded on a poster. Actor Denzel Washington said that he had been offered the lead role in the film, but he read the script and turned it down. In his opinion, the script was somehow childish and silly. At the same time, he was offered the lead role in Manchurian Candidate, and he liked the script better. The Candidate ended up costing $80 million and was a flop at the box office. After Denzel, the writers turned to Will Smith. Smith agreed to star in a childish and silly movie, but asked for $20 million and 10% of the future box office. That's what he got for the previous movie Men in Black 2. But Will Smith was asked to take it easy, and after a little negotiation, Will Smith only got $28 million for his part. And the estimated budget for the film, which was going to be kept under $100 million, went up by almost a third. While they searched for actors and inflated the budget, the script also managed to change a lot. At one point it was written by James Winter, who was responsible for the Final Fantasy. But when his work was seen at the studio, he was immediately fired because he wrote some crap. He was replaced by Lawrence Connor and Mark Rosenthal, who had just scripted Planet of the Apes at Fox Studios. When they finished the script, they presented it to the studio, and they were fired because they wrote more crap. And then the studio brought James Winter back and asked him to rewrite his script, but with less violence. And Fox Studios president Tom Rothman got involved in the film, who was gushing with brilliant ideas and asked for all of them to be included in the script. When Winter finished it, the studio decided that it was crap and shouldn't be filmed. His work was seen by writer Gary Whitta, who is in charge of After Earth and Rogue One. He thinks it's the most brilliant script he has ever read, but its brilliance wasn't appreciated by the studio, and Akiva Goldsman was pulled into the project, who had to rewrite the whole thing and only leave the plot to the genius ideas of the head of the Fox Studios. Although Goldsman seems to have completely rewritten Winter's script, later on, Winter and the Screenwriters Guild would push his name into the credits, cause he could prove that Goldsman was largely copying his work. After the film's release, many people involved in the production will say that if you feel like there is some nonsense going on, it's definitely Tom Rothman's genius idea that was forced into the film. Anyway, the studio ended up with Frankenstein's monster as a script, which Will Smith was forced to star for $28 million. It's alleged that he didn't care much about the screenwriters' wars, and the only thing he kept saying to all the new writers is that he has to save the humanity in every movie he's in, and he demanded that they won't forget it. But director Alex Proyas, who saw what was happening to the script, attempted to flee, but contractual obligations forced him to stay. When filming started, conflicts on the set reached a new level. Alex Proyas insisted that Will Smith's character shouldn't be a funny joker in the movie, and Will Smith agreed with him. The studio was against it and demanded a typical Will Smith. Proyas deliberately shot most of the jokes so that they could be painlessly cut during the post-production, in case something went wrong. And there was also Tom Rothman, who decided that this was the major studio film of the year, which meant that it had to be given a lot of time. Otherwise, the writers were bound to screw something up. Proyas, who had Crow and Dark City under his belt, was the hardest hit. Rothman would come on the set every day and tell him how to shoot a scene if he thought it wasn't shot properly. Proyas recounts that making iRobot was the most terrifying experience of his career. He said it was like running a marathon, and the studio kept throwing chairs at his feet and hitting him with sticks. At one point, he wanted to have an open confrontation with the head of the Fox Studios. But his friends warned him that this could lead to the fact that he would no longer work not only in Hollywood, but also in Europe. Apparently, he didn't want to make Indian movies. The director claimed that when they finished working on the film, he was able to get the producers to give him the original ending. Rothman threatened that if they didn't like it in the test screenings, he would take it off and replace it with the one that suits it more. After working on iRobot, Proyas vowed not to work on any more studio projects, and he kept his word on his next film, knowing. But Gods of Egypt is already a studio film for the most part. For years, the director, because of this little nuance, couldn't get that movie into the works. So, in the end, after many years, he had to make concession. Because Gods of Egypt also had every chance of failing with only independent financing. As for Rothman, who looks like a natural supervillain, I would like to point out a few moments of his biography, so that he doesn't look like a psychopath who got his hands on the management. He's been in charge of film production at Fox since '96. In 2000s, he became head of Fox and all of its divisions. He was the one to take the risk with James Cameron's Titanic. X-Men and Ice Age also came out thanks to his actions, as well as Slumdog Millionaire, which went on to win 8 Academy Awards, for which no one wanted to allocate money. It is true that no one likes when their work is being interfered, especially directors and screenwriters. And it may well be true, all the bad things in the movie iRobot came thanks to Rothman, who, after his great success in the studio under his direction, began to consider himself overly talented. Or maybe, after the criticism that came down on the film from the various channels on its release, Proyas, who was considered to be a creator after his movies Crow and Dark City, simply decided to cover himself up with someone else. Critics, unlike ordinary viewers, didn't like iRobot. During filming, the studio was also sued by a real-life company, US Robotics, but it turned out that in Asimov's books this name had appeared before the appearance of such company, and therefore the studio refused to change it in a film, which is actually quite funny. iRobot is considered the record-breaking film of 2003, for the number of commercials in the film. But because of the abundance of commercials putting off the screen, it is believed that half of the budget of the film I, Robot was recouped even before it was released. I, Robot is one of the few big budget films that didn't require any extra reshoots or extra works on editing. The very first version of the picture, which went to the test audience, eventually made its way into the cinemas. Sometimes you can find statements on the web that it was almost the best test screenings in the history of Fox Studios. The film was praised by all who saw it. The film hit the US box office in July 2004 and took in $52 million in its first weekend, knocking second Spider-Man out of the first place. It seems to be a good result within expectations, but the next week, New Born hit the box office and I, Robot began to crumble. Here too the studio is often blamed, and usually these accusations have to do with the rush to release the film. Thinking it had the real bomb on its hands, the studio was in a hurry. Composer Marco Beltrami wrote the music for the whole film in 17 days. There was simply no more time, but the film had to go to the theaters. Bourne Supremacy took in $176 million at the US box office at the budget of $75, and I, Robot only grossed $144 million on a budget of $120. The world got it right and the film got $203 million. And although the worldwide box office numbers of $347 million on a production budget of $120, it's a success in any case, the studio was rumored to be very disappointed. For example, the aforementioned Hancock and I Am Legend, with the same Will Smith, followed by a Robot, grossed $600 million on a budget of $150. The difference is noticeable, and while the sequel was still talked about, probably dissatisfaction with the box office figures prevented the studio from offering Smith even more money. After all, figures like that aren't usually worth $30 million in royalties to the titular actor. Producer John Davies also hinted at the inability to settle the financial issues. He said that the sequel had been tried several times, but it stalled at the negotiation stage with Overbrook Films, which is owned by Will Smith. And Steven Spielberg liked I, Robot so much that he later agreed with Tom Rothman on co-financing the film Robocalypse, which, thanks to its storyline, could well become the unofficial sequel to I, Robot. All the money issues have been sorted out, and the project itself is still alive, but its launch is also hampered by ongoing problems with the script. That was back in 2012, and the project came back to life in 2018, when Steven Spielberg said he was too old for this, and now Michael Bay will take over the film, and he's going to be a big-time producer. But here too, pompous statement about the incredible power of the blockbuster quickly fell silent. Although they point to the virus situation as the main problem that made it dangerous to make such an expensive movie. But in any case, most people like I, Robot, as you can see from the high ratings on the profile boards. And maybe the fact that there wasn't a sequel isn't such a bad thing, because the second part are almost always much worse than the first ones. Thanks for your attention and stay tuned.